Before we begin, drop a comment below with your country and what time it is right now where you're watching. Whether it's sunrise in Nairobi, midnight in New York, afternoon in Canada, or evening in France, I want to know. Don't just sit back, tell me where in the world you are. Now let's dive into the story. The smoke came first, black and thick against the sunset sky, rising from the canyon floor like a demon's breath. Caleb Thornwood saw it from his porch, the cup of coffee going cold in his hand as his eyes narrowed on the plume 2 miles out. He'd been alone on his ranch for 3 years now, ever since his wife passed giving birth to their stillborn son. And in that time, he'd learned to read the desert like other men read newspapers. That smoke meant trouble. He grabbed his rifle, saddled his horse Thunder, and rode hard toward the flames, the red sun bleeding across the New Mexico horizon. His heart pounded not with fear, but with that old familiar pull. The need to help, even when helping had cost him everything before. The wind carried the smell of burning wood and something else. Flesh. When Caleb reached the canyon, he saw the overturned wagon wedged between 2 boulders, flames licking up the sides like hungry tongues. The horses were dead, arrows in their flanks, and scattered around the wreckage were bodies, white men, traders by the look of their goods. But it was the sound that froze him. A voice deep and strong calling out in Apache, then switching to broken English. "Help! Please, I'm trapped!" Caleb dismounted and ran toward the flames, his boots kicking up dust, his eyes watering from the smoke. That's when he saw her. A woman, massive in height and build, pinned beneath the wagon's side rail, her deerskin dress torn and bloodied, her long black hair matted with ash. She was easily 6.5 feet tall, her shoulders broad as a man's, her face beautiful despite the soot and pain etched across it. "Don't move," Caleb shouted. Though he knew the command was pointless, she couldn't move even if she wanted to. He assessed the situation fast. The wagon was angled wrong, the fire spreading. Maybe 2 minutes before the whole thing exploded from the whiskey barrels, he could see cracked open beneath the frame. He jammed his rifle into the ground, grabbed a thick branch lying nearby, and wedged it under the wagon's edge. "When I lift, you pull yourself out," he yelled. She nodded, her dark eyes locking onto his with an intensity that made his breath catch. He counted to 3, threw all his weight onto that branch, and the wagon shifted just enough. She dragged herself free with a grunt, her leg bleeding badly, and Caleb grabbed her arm and hauled her away from the wreck, just as the flames found the whiskey. The explosion threw them both forward, heat searing across Caleb's back as they tumbled into the dirt. He rolled, covering his head, then scrambled to his feet and ran back to her. She was conscious, but struggling too. "Breathe!" her hand clutching her side where blood seeped through her fingers. "Easy," Caleb said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I got you." He tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it to her wound, his hands working fast. She stared at him like she was seeing a ghost, her lips moving but no sound coming out. "You're safe now," he told her, though he wasn't sure that was true. Whoever had attacked this wagon might still be watching. He glanced at the ridge above them, saw nothing but shadow and stone, then lifted her arm over his shoulder. She was heavy, solid muscle and bone, but he managed to get her onto Thunder's back. He climbed up behind her, holding her steady, and rode for his ranch as the sky turned from red to black. Back at the ranch, Caleb worked through the night, cleaning her wounds by lamplight, stitching the deep gash on her thigh with steady hands. She drifted in and out of consciousness, murmuring in Apache, sometimes crying out. He recognized a few words: father, honor, failed, but mostly it was a language he didn't speak. By dawn, her fever broke, and she opened her eyes fully for the first time. They were dark brown, flecked with gold, and they studied him with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. "You saved me," she said in English, her accent thick but clear. Caleb nodded, wiping his hands on a rag. "Couldn't leave you there." She tried to sit up, winced, and fell back onto the cot. "My name is Ayasha," she said. It means little one. Caleb almost smiled at the irony. There was nothing little about her. Caleb Thornwood, he replied, and you need to rest. But even as he said it, he saw her eyes flick toward the door, toward the desert beyond, and he knew she was already thinking about leaving, about whatever waited for her out there in the wild. Ayasha slept fitfully through the morning, her body fighting the pain and exhaustion that came with survival. Caleb sat on his porch, rifle across his lap, watching the horizon. He'd been a rancher long enough to know when something was coming. The air felt different, charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. He sipped his coffee, now reheated from yesterday's pot, and thought about the woman inside his house. She was Apache, that much was clear, but her size was unusual, even among her people. He'd heard stories of warrior women, tall and fierce, but had always assumed they were exaggerations. Now he wasn't so sure. The sun climbed higher, turning the desert floor into a shimmering mirror of heat, and still nothing moved out there. But Caleb's instincts told him to stay alert. Something was coming. Around noon, Ayasha woke. Caleb heard her stirring and went inside, finding her sitting up on the cot, her face pale but determined. "You should rest more," he said, but she shook her head. "I must leave," she replied. "My father will come looking for me. If he finds me here, with you—" She stopped, her eyes darkening with something Caleb couldn't quite read. Fear, shame. "With me." "What?" he pressed. Ayasha looked away, her jaw tight. "He will not understand. He will think things that are not true." Caleb frowned. "I saved your life. That's all there is to understand." She met his eyes then, and he saw the weight she carried. "In my father's world, a woman alone with a white man is already ruined. It does not matter what happened, only what appears to have happened." The words hung between them, heavy and bitter. Caleb wanted to argue, to tell her that her father would be grateful, but he knew better. He'd lived on the border between white and Apache land long enough to understand the rules that governed both sides. Rules written in blood and broken trust. "Then we'll tell him the truth," Caleb said simply. "We'll tell him you were attacked, that I helped, and that's the end of it." Ayasha almost smiled, but there was no humor in it. "The truth does not always set you free, Caleb Thornwood. Sometimes it only makes the cage smaller." She tried to stand, groaned, and sat back down hard. Caleb moved to help her, but she waved him off. "I can manage," she said through gritted teeth. He watched her struggle, saw the pride and pain fighting for control in her body, and decided to let her fight that battle alone. Some things a person had to do for themselves. By mid-afternoon, Caleb saw them. 3 riders on the ridge to the east, sitting still as statues, watching his ranch. He grabbed his rifle and stepped outside, shading his eyes against the sun. The riders didn't move, didn't signal, just watched. Caleb's gut tightened. He went back inside and found Ayasha standing by the window, her face drained of color. "It's him," she whispered. "My father." Caleb looked out at the riders again. The one in the center sat taller than the others, his posture radiating authority even from a distance. "He hasn't come down yet," Caleb said. "Maybe he's waiting for a sign." Ayasha shook her head. "He's deciding." Caleb turned to her. "Deciding what?" She met his eyes, and he saw genuine fear there for the first time. "Whether to kill you or talk to you." The words sent a chill down Caleb's spine, but he kept his face neutral. He'd faced down rustlers, rattlesnakes, and rogue soldiers in his time. He could face one Apache father. "Then let's go talk to him," Caleb said, moving toward the door. Ayesha grabbed his arm, her grip strong enough to bruise. "You don't understand. My father is Nalnish. He leads 3 tribes. He has buried 2 wives and 5 sons. I am all he has left, and he raised me to be a warrior because he had no choice. If he believes I've been dishonored, he will kill you to restore my name, and then he will cast me out to die alone in the desert." Caleb stared at her, processing the weight of what she'd just said. "So what do we do?" he asked. Ayasha released his arm and looked back out the window. We wait, she said quietly. We wait, and we pray he chooses wisdom over rage. They came at sunset, 3 riders descending from the ridge like shadows given form. Caleb stood on his porch, rifle lowered but ready, watching them approach. Ayasha stood beside him, her injured leg wrapped tight, her face a mask of controlled emotion. The leader, Nalnish, rode a paint horse that moved with the grace of a predator. He was older than Caleb expected, his face lined and weathered, his long grey hair braided with leather and bone. But his eyes were sharp, missing nothing. And when they landed on Caleb, they carried the weight of judgment. The 2 warriors flanking him were younger, their expressions hostile, hands resting on their weapons. They stopped 20 feet from the porch, and for a long moment, nobody spoke. The desert wind whistled through the canyon, carrying dust and tension. Nalnish spoke first, his voice deep and measured, words in Apache that flowed like river water over stone. Ayasha responded, her tone respectful but firm. They went back and forth for a minute, and Caleb caught bits and pieces, his own name, the word for fire, something that sounded like honor. Finally, Nalnish switched to English, his accent thick but his meaning clear. You saved my daughter from fire, he said, not quite a question. Caleb nodded. I did. Nalnish's eyes narrowed. And then you brought her here, to your home, alone. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Caleb felt his jaw tighten but kept his voice steady. She was bleeding badly. She needed help. I gave it. Nalnish studied him for a long time, then looked at Ayasha. Is this true? She lifted her chin. Yes, father. He is an honorable man. He asked for nothing. He gave everything. The words seemed to shift something in Nalnish's expression, a slight softening around his eyes, but his posture remained rigid. He dismounted slowly, his movements deliberate, and walked closer to the porch. The 2 warriors tensed but didn't follow. I have lived 62 winters, Nalnish said, his gaze never leaving Caleb's face. I have fought the Mexican army, the American cavalry, and my own people when honor demanded it. I've seen men like you before, white men who think one act of kindness erases generations of blood. Caleb felt anger flare in his chest but swallowed it down. I'm not trying to erase anything, he said quietly. I'm just trying to live right. Nalnish tilted his head, considering this. Living right, he repeated, as if tasting the words. What does that mean to you, Caleb Thornwood? Caleb thought about his dead wife, his stillborn son, the ranch he'd built with his own hands, the loneliness that followed him like a shadow. It means helping when you can, he said finally, even when it costs you. Nalnish's expression shifted again, something almost like respect flickering across his features. He turned to Ayasha and spoke in Apache, a rapid-fire exchange that ended with her eyes widening in shock. She shook her head, arguing, but Nalnish raised his hand and she fell silent. Then he turned back to Caleb, and when he spoke, his words changed everything. You saved my daughter's life. By our law, by our customs, that creates a debt that must be repaid. I am a man of honor. I cannot let this debt stand. Caleb relaxed slightly, thinking this was heading toward gratitude, maybe an offer of friendship. But then Nalnish said the words that made his blood run cold. I ask you to marry my daughter. Take her as your wife. Give her children. Give her the life I can no longer provide. The silence that followed was deafening. Caleb's mind reeled, trying to process what he'd just heard. He looked at Ayesha, saw the shock and humiliation on her face, and understood instantly that she'd had no idea this was coming. I can't, Caleb started, but Nalnish cut him off. You can refuse, he said simply. But if you do, Ayesha will be marked as a woman who spent a night alone with a white man. She will never marry among our people. She will live in shame until she dies. This is the consequence of what happened, whether you intended it or not. So I offer you this choice. Marry her and honor the bond you created by saving her, or refuse and destroy her future. Caleb felt trapped, the walls closing in. You can't put this on me, he said, his voice rough. I didn't ask for any of this. Nalnish's face hardened. Neither did she. Yet here we are. He stepped closer, his eyes boring into Caleb's. I do not make this request lightly. I know what I'm asking, but I also know my daughter. She is strong, loyal, and fierce. She will make you a good wife if you let her. And you... He paused, his gaze sweeping over the ranch, the well-kept buildings, the signs of a man who worked hard and lived honestly. You are not like other white men I've met. You have honor. You have land. You need a partner. She needs a future. This is the solution. Caleb looked at Ayasha again, saw the tears she was fighting to hold back, the pride that kept her spine straight even as her world crumbled around her. He thought about saying no, about sending them away, about going back to his lonely life. But something in her eyes stopped him. Not pleading, not hope, just resignation. And that broke something in him he didn't know was still intact. Caleb stood on his porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the desert in shades of purple and gold. Nalnish waited, still as a carved statue, his eyes never leaving Caleb's face. Behind him, the two warriors sat on their horses, watching with barely concealed hostility. Ayasha stood rigid beside Caleb, her breathing shallow, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. The weight of the moment pressed down on all of them, heavy as stone. Caleb's mind raced through possibilities, looking for an escape that didn't exist. He could say no, send them away and go back to his life. But that meant condemning Ayasha to a future of shame in her own community. He could say yes, marry a woman he barely knew to satisfy some ancient law of honor. Both choices felt impossible. Both choices felt like surrender. How long do I have to decide? Caleb asked finally, his voice cutting through the silence like a knife. Nalnish's expression didn't change. You have until the sun rises tomorrow. I will return then for your answer. He paused, then added, but know this. If you refuse, I will take my daughter back to our village, and she will live out her days caring for orphan children, never to marry, never to have a family of her own. That is the punishment for a woman who has been compromised. The word hung in the air like poison. Ayasha flinched but said nothing. Caleb felt anger surge through him again, hot and righteous. She wasn't compromised, he said through gritted teeth. Nothing happened. Nalnish shrugged, a gesture that carried centuries of cultural weight. It does not matter what happened. It matters what people will believe. And they will believe the worst. They always do. Without another word, Nalnish mounted his horse and rode back toward the ridge, his warriors following. They disappeared into the gathering darkness, leaving Caleb and Ayasha alone with the impossible decision. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Caleb stared out at the desert, his mind churning. Ayasha stood motionless, her face turned away from him. Finally, she broke the silence. You should say no, she said quietly, her English carefully measured. I will not have you forced into this. I will bear my shame and live with it. I have survived worse. Caleb turned to look at her, really look at her for the first time since the demand had been made. Even injured, even humiliated, she stood tall and proud, her shoulders back, her chin lifted. She was beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with softness. She was strength made flesh. What would you do? Caleb asked. If you were me, what would you do? Ayasha finally met his eyes, and he saw the exhaustion there, the weight of a lifetime of being different, of being too tall, too strong, too much for the world she'd been born into. I would choose freedom, she said simply. Always freedom, no matter the cost. Caleb nodded slowly, understanding flooding through him. But you're not free, are you? He said. You haven't been for a long time. Something flickered in her expression, Pain, recognition, relief at being seen. No, she admitted. I have been my father's soldier, my tribe's protector, the woman who is too big to be a woman and too female to be a warrior. I've been everything except myself. She looked down at her hands, scarred from training and battle. This would just be another cage. A different shape, but still a cage. Caleb walked to the edge of the porch and sat down on the steps, suddenly exhausted. Ayasha hesitated, then lowered herself carefully beside him, wincing as her injured leg protested. They sat in silence for a while, watching the stars emerge one by one against the darkening sky. I had a wife once, Caleb said eventually. Sarah. She died 3 years ago, giving birth to our son. He died too. I buried them together, under that cottonwood tree by the creek. He pointed toward the shadow of a large tree visible in the moonlight. I swore I'd never marry again. Couldn't bear the thought of losing someone else. Ayasha listened without interrupting, her presence solid and comforting beside him. But I'm tired of being alone, Caleb continued, his voice rough with emotion. I'm tired of eating meals by myself, of talking to my horse like he's a person, of waking up in an empty house. I built this ranch for a family, for a future, and now it's just empty. He turned to look at her and found her already watching him with those gold-flecked eyes. I don't love you, he said bluntly, and you don't love me, but maybe that's not the worst place to start. Ayasha's lips twitched, almost a smile. My father says love is a luxury. Respect and partnership are what matter. Caleb nodded. Your father's a smart man, even if his timing is terrible. This time Ayasha did smile, brief but genuine. He is used to getting his way. He was not always like this, hard and demanding. But after my brothers died, after my mother passed, he became desperate to protect me, to control what he could control. This is his way of ensuring I survive, even if it means sacrificing my choice. Caleb understood that kind of love, fierce and suffocating, trying to protect by building walls. So what do we do? He asked, echoing the question from earlier. Do I say yes? Do I say no? Do we run away and start over somewhere neither of us belongs? Ayasha was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke words that changed everything. I think, she said slowly, we say yes, but on our terms. Dawn broke cold and clear across the New Mexico desert, painting the sky in shades of pink and orange. Caleb hadn't slept. He'd spent the night in his barn, checking on Thunder, mending a broken saddle strap, and trying to convince himself he wasn't making the biggest mistake of his life. When he finally walked back to the house, he found Ayasha sitting on the porch steps, her injured legs stretched out before her, her face tilted toward the rising sun. She'd braided her hair, woven with small pieces of leather and turquoise, and despite her worn deerskin dress and visible wounds, she looked regal. She looked like someone who had made peace with her fate. I thought you might run, she said without turning around. Caleb snorted. Where would I go? This is my land, my home. He sat down beside her, close enough that their shoulders almost touched. Besides, we made a deal last night. Our terms, remember? Ayasha nodded, her expression serious. Our terms, she repeated. We marry to satisfy honor and custom. We live as partners, not prisoners. We build something real, or we don't, but we give it an honest chance. Caleb had been surprised. When she'd laid out those conditions in the dark hours before dawn, her voice steady and clear. She wanted respect, not romance. She wanted purpose, not pity. She wanted to be seen as a person, not a problem to be solved. And Caleb, tired of his own loneliness, had agreed. My father will come soon, Ayasha said, breaking into his thoughts. He will bring a medicine woman and witnesses. The ceremony will be quick, Apache tradition mixed with what he knows of white customs. She glanced at Caleb, something vulnerable flickering in her eyes. It will be binding, in both our worlds. You understand this? Caleb met her gaze steadily. I understand. I'm saying yes, Ayasha. For better or worse. The words had barely left his mouth when the riders appeared on the ridge. More than yesterday, at least a dozen. Nailnish rode at the front, and beside him was an elderly woman on a grey mare. Her face deeply lined, her eyes sharp as obsidian. They descended slowly, ceremonially, and as they approached, Caleb saw that several of the riders carried supplies, blankets, baskets, what looked like ceremonial objects. This wasn't just a quick arrangement, this was a full wedding. Nailnish dismounted and walked forward, his expression unreadable. "You have decided?" he asked, his voice carrying across the morning air. Caleb stood, Ayesha rising beside him despite her injury. "We have," Caleb said. "We'll marry, today, now, but there are conditions." Nailnish's eyebrows rose slightly. "Conditions?" Caleb felt Ayesha's hand brush against his arm, a silent gesture of support. "Ayesha is my wife, my partner, not my servant, not my property. She makes her own choices about her life, her body, her future. I work with her, not over her, and—" He paused, knowing this next part was crucial. "She keeps her name, her identity, her connection to her people. This marriage doesn't erase who she is." The silence that followed was profound. The gathered Apache watched with intense interest, waiting for Nailnish's reaction. The old chief studied Caleb for what felt like an eternity, his dark eyes searching for deception, for weakness, for anything that would give him reason to refuse. Finally, slowly, he nodded. "You surprise me, white man," Nailnish said quietly. "Perhaps there is more to you than I assumed." He turned to Ayesha, spoke in rapid Apache, and she responded with equal intensity. Caleb caught his own name, words that sounded like agreements, and then something that made several of the witnesses nod approvingly. Nailnish turned back to Caleb. "My daughter says you are honorable. She says you treated her wounds with respect, that you asked for nothing in return. She says—" He paused, his voice dropping lower. "She says you make her feel human, not too big, not too strange, just herself. For that alone, I will trust you." The ceremony began immediately. The medicine woman, introduced as Desba, moved with surprising speed despite her age, arranging stones in a circle, lighting sage that filled the air with sharp, clean smoke. She chanted in Apache, her voice rising and falling in patterns Caleb didn't understand but felt in his bones. Nailnish stood as witness, along with the other riders who formed a loose circle around them. Desba gestured for Caleb and Ayesha to step into the center of the stones, to face each other across the smoke. "Join hands," she commanded in accented English. Caleb reached out, and Ayesha placed her hands in his. They were rough, calloused from work and weapons, warm and steady. Desba wrapped a cord of braided leather around their joined hands, binding them together, then spoke words that felt ancient and powerful. She switched between Apache and English, making sure both understood the vows being spoken over them. "You are bound by fire," she said, gesturing to where Ayesha had been saved. "You are bound by blood," pointing to Ayesha's wounds. "You are bound by choice," looking meaningfully at both of them. "Let no man or spirit break what has been joined in honor." Desba produced a small clay bowl filled with water from a sacred spring and had them each drink, then share the cup between them. She placed a blanket over their shoulders, joining them beneath its weight, and spoke the final blessing. When it was done, when the cord was removed and the smoke had cleared, Nailnish stepped forward. "You are married," he said simply, "in the eyes of our people, in the eyes of your God, in the eyes of the land itself." He looked at Caleb with an expression that was part warning, part hope. "Treat her well, Caleb Thornwood. She is all I have. If you fail her, I will know, and I will come." It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. A father's final act of protection for his daughter. Caleb nodded, accepting the weight of that promise. "I'll treat her with the respect she deserves," he said. "You have my word." Nailnish seemed satisfied with that. He embraced Ayasha, speaking to her in low tones that Caleb couldn't hear, then mounted his horse. The wedding party departed as quickly as they'd come, leaving Caleb and Ayasha standing alone in front of his ranch house, their ranch house now, as husband and wife. The first week was awkward. Caleb gave Ayasha his bedroom and slept on a cot in the front room, despite her protests that she could manage the cot with her injured leg. They moved around each other like strangers in a dance, careful not to touch, not to intrude, not to assume anything. Ayasha spent her days recovering, sitting on the porch watching Caleb work the ranch, mending the clothes he'd provided, cooking meals that blended Apache and American traditions. Caleb worked harder than ever, fixing fences, tending the small herd of cattle, avoiding the house except for meals and sleep. Neither knew how to bridge the gap between them, how to turn a marriage of necessity into something resembling a partnership. The silence between them grew heavy, filling the house like floodwater, and Caleb wondered if they'd made a terrible mistake. Everything changed on the 8th day. Caleb was in the barn repairing a wagon wheel when he heard Ayasha scream. He dropped his tools and ran, heart pounding, rifle forgotten, expecting to find raiders or a snake or worse. Instead, he found her in the kitchen, standing on her good leg, staring at a pot of boiling stew that had tipped over, scalding liquid spreading across the floor. Her bandaged leg had given out when she'd tried to lift the heavy pot, and she'd fallen, catching herself on the table but sending everything crashing. She stood there, shaking with frustration and pain, tears streaming down her face. The first tears he'd seen from her since the day they met. "I can't even cook a meal," she said, her voice breaking. "I am useless, a burden. What kind of wife cannot even?" Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled her into his arms. She stiffened at first, surprised by the contact, but then she collapsed against him, sobbing into his chest. Caleb held her, one hand cradling the back of her head, the other wrapped around her waist, and let her cry. He didn't offer empty reassurances or tell her it was fine. He just held her, steady and solid, until the storm passed. When she finally pulled back, her face red and wet, she looked embarrassed. "I'm sorry," she said. "I don't know what—" Caleb shook his head. "Don't apologize. You're healing from injuries that would have killed most people. You're in a new place, with a stranger, trying to figure out a life you didn't choose. You're allowed to break down sometimes." Ayasha studied his face, searching for judgment and finding only understanding. "You lost your wife," she said quietly. "You lost your child. Yet you hold me while I cry about spilled stew. How?" Caleb managed a sad smile. "Because pain isn't a competition. Your struggle doesn't cancel out mine. We both carry weight. Maybe we can help each other carry it." Something shifted in Ayasha's expression then, a wall coming down, a door opening. She reached up and touched his face, her palm rough but gentle. "You are a good man, Caleb Thornwood," she said. "I did not expect that. I expected duty, maybe kindness, but not goodness." Caleb covered her hand with his own. "I'm just trying to do right by you, by us." Ayasha nodded slowly. "Then let me do right by you too. Let me be a partner, not a guest. Teach me your ways. Let me teach you mine. Let us build something real, like we promised." Caleb felt hope bloom in his chest for the first time since Sarah died. "I'd like that," he said, and he meant it. They cleaned up the mess together, Ayasha sitting in a chair and giving directions while Caleb mopped and salvaged what he could of the stew. They laughed when he added too much salt, trying to fix the flavor, and laughed harder when Ayasha admitted she'd been experimenting with a recipe and wasn't sure it would have tasted good anyway. They ate the salvaged meal, together at the small kitchen table, and for the first time, the silence between them felt comfortable instead of strained. After dinner, they sat on the porch as the sun set, and Ayasha told him stories of her childhood, of learning to hunt with her brothers, of her mother teaching her to weave, of the first time she realized she was taller than every man in her village and what that meant for her future. Caleb listened, asking questions, genuinely interested in understanding who she was beneath the circumstances that had brought them together. In return, Caleb told her about Sarah, how they'd met at a church social, how she'd laughed at his terrible jokes, how she'd worked beside him to build the ranch from nothing. He told her about the day Sarah died, about holding his stillborn son, about the grief that had nearly destroyed him. "I thought I'd never feel anything again," he admitted, staring out at the darkening sky. "I thought that part of me died with them, but you—" He glanced at her, saw her watching him with those intent eyes. "You make me remember what it feels like to care about someone, to want to protect someone, to hope for something beyond just surviving." Ayasha reached over and took his hand, her grip strong and sure. "Then we will hope together," she said, "for something better than survival, for something that looks like life." They sat like that until the stars came out, hands joined, two broken people beginning to believe they might heal each other. 3 weeks into their marriage, trouble arrived in the form of Clayton Marsh and his men. Marsh was a land speculator from Santa Fe, backed by railroad money, and he'd been trying to buy up Caleb's ranch for 2 years. Caleb had refused every offer, and Marsh had gotten increasingly aggressive in his tactics, cutting fences, spooking cattle, spreading rumors in town that Caleb was squatting on land he didn't own. Now Marsh rode onto Caleb's property with 5 armed men, their intentions clear from the way they spread out, hands near their weapons. Caleb saw them coming from the barn and quickly moved toward the house where Ayasha was kneading bread dough. "Stay inside," he told her, grabbing his rifle from above the door. Ayasha's eyes narrowed. "What's wrong?" Caleb glanced out the window at the approaching riders. "The man who wants my land. He's brought friends this time." Ayasha wiped her hands on her apron and moved to the window, assessing the situation with the practiced eye of a warrior. 6 men, all armed. They mean violence. Caleb nodded grimly. "I know. That's why you need to stay." But Ayasha was already moving, reaching for the rifle Caleb had given her 2 weeks ago when he'd started teaching her to shoot. Her leg had healed enough for her to move freely now, though she still limped slightly. "I'm your wife," she said firmly. "Your partner. I will not hide while you face danger alone." Caleb wanted to argue, but he saw the determination in her face and knew it would be pointless. Besides, a part of him, the part that had been watching her prove her strength every day, was relieved to have her beside him. "Stay behind me," he said, "and don't shoot unless I do." Ayasha's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. "We will see." They stepped onto the porch together as Marsh and his men rode up to the house. Marsh was a well-dressed man in his 40s, his suit dusty from travel, his eyes cold and calculating. He reined in his horse and smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "Thornwood," he said pleasantly, "I've come with a final offer. $10,000 for your land. That's twice what I offered last time." Caleb kept his rifle lowered but ready. "And my answer is the same. No, this land is mine. It's not for sale." Marsh's smile faded. "That's disappointing. I was hoping we could settle this civilly." His eyes slid to Ayasha, and something ugly flickered in his expression. "I see you've taken an Indian wife. How progressive of you. Does she come with the land, or would you want extra for her?" The words were deliberately insulting, designed to provoke. Caleb felt rage surge through him, but before he could respond, Ayasha stepped forward. "I am Apache," she said, her English clear and cold. "I am the daughter of Nalnish, chief of 3 tribes. I am a warrior trained by men better than you will ever be, and I'm this man's wife by choice and by honor." She raised her rifle, not quite pointing it at Marsh, but making her capability clear. "You will speak with respect, or you will leave. There is no third option." Marsh's men shifted nervously in their saddles, clearly not expecting this. Marsh himself looked uncertain for the first time, his eyes calculating the odds. "Now listen here," he started, But Ayasha cut him off. No, you listen. This land belongs to my husband. It will never be yours. Not for money, not for threats, not for violence. You are outnumbered by the spirits of this place, by the honor that built it, and by two people who would rather die than surrender what is theirs. So ride away, while you still can. The standoff lasted for what felt like an eternity, tension crackling in the air like lightning about to strike. Marsh looked at Caleb, saw the resolve there, looked at Ayasha, saw something that made him reassess his strategy. Finally, he tipped his hat in a mockery of politeness. We'll see about that, he said. The railroad wants this route Thornwood. They'll get it one way or another. You're just delaying the inevitable. He turned his horse and rode away, his men following, but not before one of them spat in their direction, a final gesture of contempt. Caleb and Ayasha stood watching until the riders disappeared over the ridge. Then Caleb let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. That was incredibly dangerous, he said. Ayasha shrugged, lowering her rifle. So is living. We might as well choose how we face it. Caleb looked at her. His wife, his partner, this woman who had been forced into his life and had somehow become essential to it, and felt something click into place. This was what marriage was supposed to be. Not romance and roses, but two people standing together against the world. The confrontation with Marsh changed something fundamental between Caleb and Ayasha. The careful distance they'd maintained, the polite uncertainty, burned away in the heat of that shared danger. That night, after they'd secured the ranch and checked every fence line for sabotage, they sat together at the kitchen table and talked for hours. Not about their past or their circumstances, but about their future. What they wanted to build. What kind of life they could create together if they really tried. Ayasha spoke of wanting to learn ranching properly, to understand the business side, to be more than just a helper. Caleb spoke of expanding the herd, maybe starting a horse breeding operation, of building something that could sustain a family. The word family hung between them, unspoken but present, a possibility neither was quite ready to name but both were beginning to imagine. Over the following weeks, they fell into a rhythm that felt less like obligation and more like choice. Caleb taught Ayasha everything he knew about ranching, how to read cattle, how to predict weather, how to manage resources through the harsh seasons. She learned with fierce intelligence, asking questions, offering insights from her own knowledge of living off the land. In return, she taught him about tracking, about reading signs in nature that he'd missed his whole life, about herbal medicine and survival techniques that had kept her people alive for generations. They worked side by side from dawn until dusk, their conversations ranging from practical ranch business to deeper questions about life, honor, and what it meant to build something lasting. Slowly, almost without noticing, the space between them began to close. One evening, after a particularly long day mending fences, they bathed in the creek behind the house as the sun set. They'd grown comfortable with each other's bodies by now, not in a romantic sense, but in the practical way of people who lived and worked together. Ayasha had seen Caleb's scarred back, the legacy of a childhood accident he rarely spoke of. Caleb had helped Ayasha change bandages, had seen the war wounds that marked her body like a map of her life's battles. But tonight, as they sat on the creek bank drying off, something shifted. Ayasha looked at Caleb in the golden light and said, "I think I'm beginning to love you." The words were simple, stated like a fact rather than a declaration, and they hit Caleb with unexpected force. He turned to her, saw the vulnerability in her eyes, the courage it took to speak that truth. "I think I'm beginning to love you too," he said, and realized as he spoke that it was true, not the desperate, all-consuming love he'd had with Sarah, but something quieter, steadier, built on respect and shared struggle and the daily choice to stay. Ayasha smiled, genuine and full, and Caleb felt his heart crack open. "What do we do now?" she asked. Caleb reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I think we stop sleeping in separate rooms," he said softly. "I think we stop pretending this is temporary. I think we build the life we talked about and see where it goes. Ayasha nodded, then leaned forward and kissed him. Tentative at first, then with growing confidence. When they pulled apart, both were smiling. I never thought I would have this, Ayasha said. A partner, a home, a man who sees me as equal. Caleb pulled her closer. I never thought I'd want it again, but here we are. That night, they moved Caleb's things into the bedroom they would share, and for the first time since they'd married, their home felt complete. The next morning, they woke tangled together, sunlight streaming through the window, and Caleb knew with absolute certainty that he'd made the right choice. Ayesha stirred beside him, her face peaceful in sleep, and he marveled at how she'd become essential to his life in such a short time. When she opened her eyes and found him watching, she didn't look surprised or self-conscious. She just smiled. "Good morning, husband," she said. Caleb grinned. "Good morning, wife." They lay there for a few more minutes, neither in a hurry to start the day, just existing together in the quiet dawn. Finally, Ayasha sat up, stretching. "I dreamed last night," she said, "of children, 2 boys and a girl. The boys had your eyes. The girl had my height." She glanced at him, almost shy. It felt real. Caleb sat up beside her, his hand finding hers. "Maybe it will be," he said. "Someday, if that's what we want." Ayasha squeezed his hand. "I think I do want that. With you." And Caleb, who had buried his dreams of family with his wife and son 3 years ago, felt them stir back to life. 2 months after their marriage, Marsh made his final move. It came in the form of forged documents claiming Caleb's land deed was invalid, that the property had been illegally purchased from the Mexican government and now reverted to federal control, which meant it could be sold to the railroad. Caleb found out when the sheriff rode out with an eviction notice, looking apologetic but determined. "I don't want to do this, Thornwood," Sheriff Coleman said, handing over the papers. "But the territorial judge signed off on it. You've got 1 week to vacate or I have to remove you by force." Caleb read the documents with growing fury. They were elaborate forgeries, backed by railroad money and legal manipulation. Marsh had been patient, building his case while Caleb and Ayasha built their life, and now he was moving in for the kill. Ayasha read the papers over Caleb's shoulder, her face darkening. "This is false," she said flatly. "All of it." Sheriff Coleman nodded. "I suspect you're right. But proving it in court would take months and more money than you probably have. Marsh knows that. He's counting on you giving up." Caleb looked at his ranch, the buildings he'd maintained, the land he'd worked, the life he and Ayasha were building. Rage and desperation warred inside him. "I'm not leaving," he said. "This is my home, our home. If Marsh wants it, he'll have to take it by force." Coleman sighed. "Don't make me do that, Caleb. Please." Caleb met the sheriff's eyes. "Then don't come back in a week. Give me time to fight this the right way." Coleman hesitated, then nodded slowly. "I'll give you 2 weeks. After that, my hands are tied." He rode away, leaving Caleb and Ayasha standing in the yard, facing the reality that everything they'd built was about to be stolen. That night, Ayasha made a suggestion that changed everything. "My father," she said. "He has connections, other chiefs, tribal leaders, even some white officials who respect him. Land disputes involving Apache territory are always complicated. If we can prove your land borders tribal ground or has historical significance, it might be enough to tie this up in court long enough to expose Marsh's fraud." Caleb considered this. "Would your father help? After everything—" Ayasha cut him off. "He would help because you are family now, because I ask him, and because he hates injustice more than he dislikes white men." She stood, determination hardening her features. "I will ride out tomorrow. I will bring him here, and we will fight this together. Both our peoples, both our ways." Caleb felt hope surge through him. It could be dangerous. Marsh has men watching the roads. Ayasha smiled. fierce and beautiful. Then it is good I know paths they do not. She left before dawn, riding Thunder because he was the fastest horse they had. Caleb spent the next 2 days fortifying the ranch, expecting Marsh's men to try something before the deadline. On the third day, Ayasha returned with Nalnish and 20 warriors. The old chief looked grim but determined as he surveyed the situation. "My daughter says you need help," he said. "Tell me everything." Caleb laid out the forged documents, the territorial claim, Marsh's threats. Nalnish listened carefully, then nodded. "This land borders our winter hunting grounds. We have treaty rights here that predate your American government. If Marsh tries to take your land, he violates those treaties. That brings federal scrutiny he does not want." He looked at Caleb with something like respect. "You married my daughter in good faith. You treat her well. You are family. We protect family." Caleb felt emotion tighten his throat. "Thank you," he managed. Nalnish waved off the gratitude. "Thank me when we win." The confrontation came 5 days later. Marsh arrived with 30 men, hired guns and railroad enforcers, expecting to find Caleb alone and ready to surrender. Instead, they found Caleb and Ayasha standing on the porch, backed by Nalnish and his warriors, with Sheriff Coleman riding up at the same moment with federal marshals. The marshals had been contacted by Nalnish through his connections, and they carried orders to investigate the land claim before any eviction proceeded. Marsh's face went white as he realized his plan had fallen apart. The marshals examined the documents, interviewed witnesses Nalnish had brought, including an elderly Mexican official who confirmed Caleb's original deed was legitimate, and within 2 hours they arrested Marsh for fraud and attempted theft. As Marsh was led away in chains, he looked at Caleb with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he spat. Caleb stepped forward, Ayasha beside him. "Yes," he said quietly, "it is. You lose. We win. And you'll remember that from prison." Marsh was dragged away, and Caleb turned to find Ayasha watching him with pride in her eyes. They'd won. Together. And their home was safe. 5 years later, Caleb stood on his porch, the same porch where Nalnish had made his impossible request, where he and Ayasha had first stood as husband and wife, and watched the sunset paint the desert gold and crimson. Behind him, he heard laughter. His son, 4-year-old Thomas, was chasing his older sister, 6-year-old Sarah, around the yard while Ayasha watched from her chair, heavily pregnant with their third child. The ranch had prospered beyond anything Caleb had imagined. With Nalnish's help, they'd expanded into horse breeding, supplying cavalry posts and ranches across the territory. Ayasha had proven to be a natural businesswoman, negotiating deals that honored both Apache and American traditions, building bridges between communities that had been enemies for generations. Their home had become a gathering place, a neutral ground where white ranchers and Apache leaders could meet, trade, and slowly build trust. Thomas crashed into Caleb's legs, giggling, and Caleb scooped him up. The boy had his mother's eyes and his father's stubborn chin. "Papa, tell the story," Thomas demanded. "The fire story." Caleb glanced at Ayasha, who smiled and nodded. It had become their children's favorite tale. How Caleb had saved their mother from the burning wagon. How Nalnish had made his request. How 2 strangers had become partners, and then lovers, and finally a family. "All right," Caleb said, carrying Thomas over to sit beside Ayasha. Sarah climbed onto her mother's lap, careful of the baby in her belly. "It started with smoke," Caleb began, launching into the familiar story. The children listened with rapt attention, even though they'd heard it dozens of times, interrupting with questions and comments as he went. When he finished, Sarah looked up at Ayasha with serious eyes. "Mama, were you scared," she asked, "when grandfather said Papa had to marry you?" Ayasha considered the question carefully. "Yes," she said honestly. "I was scared. I didn't know your papa. I didn't know if he would be kind or cruel. I didn't know if I would ever be happy again." She looked at Caleb, love clear in her expression. "But your papa surprised me. He saw me, not as a problem or a prize, but as a person. And slowly, we built something neither of us expected. We built love. Thomas wrinkled his nose. Love is gross, he declared, making everyone laugh. Caleb ruffled his son's hair. You say that now. Wait until you meet someone who makes you feel like your mama makes me feel. Then you'll understand. Ayasha reached over and took Caleb's hand, their fingers intertwining automatically, a gesture so familiar now it was like breathing. That night, after the children were asleep, Caleb and Ayasha sat on the porch, as they had so many times before. The stars were brilliant overhead, the desert quiet except for the occasional coyote call. Do you ever regret it? Ayasha asked suddenly. Saying yes to my father's request? Caleb thought about it honestly. I regret how it happened, he said finally. I wish we'd had the choice from the beginning, but regret the result? Never. He turned to face her fully. You are the best thing that ever happened to me, Ayasha. You and our children and this life we've built. If I could go back and change that day, I wouldn't. Because every difficult moment, every struggle, every doubt, it all led here, to this, to us. Tears shimmered in Ayasha's eyes. I feel the same, she whispered. I thought I was being punished that day, but I was being given a gift. You, us, a future I never imagined I could have. They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Then Ayasha spoke again. My father is dying, she said quietly. Caleb's heart clenched. He'd known Nalnish's health was failing, but hearing it stated so plainly was still painful. I'm sorry, he said. Ayasha nodded, tears spilling over. He told me yesterday he is ready, that he has seen me happy, has held his grandchildren, has made peace with old enemies. He says his impossible request gave him the ending he needed. She leaned into Caleb's shoulder. He was right, you know, about you. He saw something in you that day, something honorable, and he trusted you with his greatest treasure, me. Caleb wrapped his arms around her, holding her close. He gave me mine too, he said. His impossible request saved us both. They stayed like that, wrapped in each other and the night, two people who had been forced together by circumstance and had chosen each other every day since. Their story had started with fire and smoke and an impossible demand, but it had become something beautiful, a testament to the power of choice, respect, and the quiet, steady love that grows when two people commit to building something real together. As the stars wheeled overhead and the desert breathed around them, Caleb and Ayasha knew that they had been given something rare. Not a perfect love, but a true one, and that made all the difference.